The night my daughter told me over veal marsala and Sinatra not to show my face at her wedding. The clink of her wineglass felt louder than the music. Names Gideon March 58, a retired controller gripping the cold edge of my old Heartland badge in my pocket. Ever had a moment where family turned formal? What would you have done? It was supposed to be just another dinner, one of those formality-laden evenings that Seraphine insisted on holding before any milestone in her life. The kind of gathering where every detail felt scripted, the way the waiter circled our table with the Chianti, the way Sinatra crooned softly overhead, the glint of gold on Corbin Hale's cufflinks as he ran his thumb over them. The warmth of the restaurant felt almost artificial. A stage set for a play I didn't realize I'd been cast in, until my daughter leaned forward across the white linen tablecloth. The candlelight caught in her earrings as she said, her voice even, but sharp enough to cut through the hum of the dining room. "Don't show your face at this wedding." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. The murmur of other diners, the faint hiss of wine pouring into crystal, and Sinatra's fading line about strangers in the night almost drowned her out. But Seraphine's eyes stayed on mine, bright and cold, like she was reading a line she'd rehearsed. I felt the weight of my old Heartland group badge in my coat pocket, a habit I never shook even 3 years after retiring. It pressed against my leg like a reminder of who I was before all this. Before I became someone they could dismiss as a relic. That badge had seen 40 years of late nights and ledgers. Now it sat there like a coin from a dead empire, waiting for its last humiliation. Corbin sat back in his chair, his expression smooth as ever, the faintest flick of a smile on his lips as his thumb traced those cufflinks again. It wasn't joy, it was calculation. Loretta, his mother, sat to Seraphine's right, every inch of her posture immaculate. Her perfume just strong enough to mix with the scent of garlic and basil in the air. Her eyes, a steely shade of gray, didn't linger on me long, but every glance felt like a silent verdict. I've worked in rooms where millions changed hands with less tension than this table carried. Seraphine didn't stop there. She talked about how it was simpler this way, how I could avoid unpleasantness, as if my mere presence would stain the Hale family's perfect tableau. She said the words with that tight smile, her fork tapping the rim of her plate, like a metronome keeping time for my exile. When Loretta brought up the future, her voice gliding like a blade through butter, I saw her eyes flick to Corbin, who adjusted his watch band, as if the weight of the family fortune already hung on his wrist. I cut my veal marsala with a steadier hand than I felt chewing and swallowing against the bitterness crawling up my throat. The sauce was rich, the meat tender, but I could barely taste it over the metallic chill of the badge against my fingers. I rolled its edges between my thumb and forefinger, under the table, grounding myself, while the conversation carried on above me about vendors and guest lists, as though my erasure was already finalized. Every so often, Corbin's gaze slid toward me, not quite smug, not quite sympathetic, just measuring as if he were already balancing my life on some invisible ledger. As dessert menus were passed around, Seraphine leaned closer again, her tone softening into something she probably thought sounded kind. "It's for your own good, Dad," she whispered, her breath carrying the faintest trace of red wine. "You wouldn't fit in with the Hales." The words sank deeper than the initial blow, not because they were cruel, but because she said them like they were fact immutable as the winter chill outside. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and let the conversation drift back to floral arrangements and seating charts, while my mind traced the decades I'd spent building a life she now wanted scrubbed clean. When the plates were cleared and the Hales rose to leave, Loretta brushed her fingers along Seraphine's arm, a gentle signal before turning her polite glacial smile on me. "Drive safe, Gideon," she murmured, as though she hadn't just overseen my quiet expulsion from my daughter's life. Corbin offered a curt nod, already sliding into his cashmere overcoat, and Seraphine kissed my cheek, a brief, obligatory brush that felt more like punctuation than affection. Outside, the night bit through my coat, a slap of icy Pennsylvania air cutting through the residual warmth of the restaurant. The neon glow of a nearby bar sign flickered across the slick pavement, and Sinatra's voice faded completely as the door swung shut behind me. I slipped my hand into my pocket, gripping the badge until its edges dug into my palm. The condensation from my untouched wine glass still lingered cold in my fingertips. A phantom chill that matched the metal. The streets were quiet, save for the distant hum of a passing bus and the crunch of salt beneath my boots. I stood there for a long moment, staring down the block toward my car, the breath from my lips clouding and fading. Somewhere deep down, beneath the exhaustion and the sting of her words, something in me stirred, not anger exactly, but a tremor of defiance. I wondered as I started walking toward the icy lot whether I'd been silent for too long, whether it was time to stop being the quiet, retiring man everyone assumed I'd become. The badge pressed harder into my hand with every step, and for the first time in years, I didn't just feel its weight, I felt its purpose. The subject line blinked at me in harsh black text. Proposed transfer agreement. Signed by Friday. No greeting, no explanation beyond the formalities attached. Just a PDF icon waiting for me to open it. Corbin's emails always had that sharp, almost smug neatness punctuation, like polished shoes spacing like an accountant's report. I sat at the small oak desk by my front window, the winter light filtering through the frosted glass, soft but cold. The snow on the steps outside had started to melt into uneven rivulets, dripping rhythmically into the gutter like a metronome counting down to some invisible deadline. I clicked the attachment and the language hit me like a slow poison. Transfers waivers. Irrevocable relinquishment of my voting rights. My remaining heartland shares the deed to this very house I'd called home for 2 decades. I skimmed for something, anything that gave me leverage, but each line felt like a hand closing around my throat. By the 3rd page, I wasn't reading so much as watching my life carved up into neat paragraphs and bullet points. My finger traced the edge of the monitor, cold as the badge still tucked in my coat pocket, though I hadn't pulled it out yet. The smell of stale coffee drifted from the kitchen, pulling me out of the legal sludge. I pushed back from the desk and went to the pantry closet, pulling down the old lockbox I hadn't touched since Catherine's illness. It was heavier than I remembered, its corners dust-caked, leaving faint smudges on my fingertips as I carried it to the table. The metal scraped softly against the wood when I set it down, an oddly comforting sound, real solid, unlike the sterile menace of Corbin's document. The key turned stiffly, and inside the past stared back at me HOA statements with their blue and white headers. Retirement fund reports, all printed on thin paper that had yellowed around the edges. My thumb dragged across one HOA bill, smudging ink that had bled where a snow boot once dripped on it years ago. It felt like touching a scar. Somewhere in the other room, the answering machine clicked. A voice I hadn't heard in months, low and steady, filtered through the speaker. "Don't sign anything. Call me tonight." Hollis Venn sounding exactly as he had the last time we spoke, calm, direct, no wasted words. I froze, leaning against the counter as his voice replayed a small thread of rope thrown into quicksand. I replayed it twice, memorizing each syllable, even the faint static behind his breath. It was the first time all day that I felt something other than resignation creeping through me. Back at the table, I spread out the paperwork like a map of a country I was about to lose. The coffee I'd poured an hour ago sat beside it, cold and oily, a thin ring of steam long since gone. The silence of the house pressed in the kind that made the faint hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock sound louder than they should. I traced the line in Corbin's agreement where he'd worked in a clause about good faith considerations, as if stripping me of everything could be painted as a favor. I muttered it aloud, my voice rough from disuse. No more easy yes. The words hung there in the air, heavier than the lockbox itself. For years I'd signed whatever Seraphine asked: loans, tuition, down payments, always with a nod, always with a quiet, of course, as if love were a contract I could keep renewing. I watched my own hand resting on the table, fingers still dust-streaked from the lockbox, and felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, the first twinge of resolve. The phone buzzed, jolting me out of the thought. The screen lit up with a message from Hollis: meet at the station cafe tomorrow noon. Bring the badge. Just like that, concise and commanding the way he always was. I glanced at the coat draped over the chair, where the badge sat in its usual place, cold and inconspicuous. For a long time, it had just been a talisman of a life gone by. Now, as the gray light outside dimmed into evening, I wondered if that small square of metal might still have one last use, something beyond nostalgia. I set the lockbox lid back in place, the click of the latch echoing softly through the quiet kitchen, and leaned back in my chair. The shadows on the wall stretched as the sun dipped, long and wavering, like the uncertainty stretching out in front of me. I didn't know what Hollis had in mind or how deep Corbin's hooks really went, or if Seraphine even understood what she was asking me to give up. But I knew, staring at that cold coffee and the unopened reply draft on my screen, that I wouldn't be giving another easy yes, not this time. The phone buzzed again, a second reminder of tomorrow's meeting, and I let it sit on the table, its screen glowing softly against the gathering dark. The station cafe always smelled like it had been awake longer than the town itself. Burnt toast clinging to the walls, coffee so strong you could practically taste the bitterness in the air. The booths creaked when you sat down, the vinyl patched in places with duct tape, and the posters for town fairs from years past, curled at the edges like forgotten promises. I slid into the corner booth by the fogged window just as Hollis pushed a manila folder across the table, his hand steady, his expression unreadable. He didn't bother with the greeting, just nodded toward the folder. This, he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear over the hiss of the espresso machine, "Is your way to stop Corbin before he drains you dry." The words felt heavy, but my eyes drifted first to the chipped porcelain mug between us. It sat on a small saucer, a jagged crack sealed with a strip of golden tape steaming despite its wounds. The handle looked like it might give way at any moment, yet it held its coffee just fine. Patched, imperfect, still useful. I wrapped my fingers around the warm ceramic, feeling the uneven ridge of the tape. "You really think I can fight them?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window, carrying the faint whistle of a train somewhere down the line. Hollis leaned back, his silver hair catching the pale morning light seeping through the blinds. At 62, he had the same dry grin I remembered from the Heartland days, the one that said he'd seen worse storms than this. "Gideon," he said, tapping the folder with one finger, "you've got a clause buried so deep in your retirement plan, Corbin probably doesn't even know it exists. Passive shareholder rights. It means you can freeze any transfer of funds tied to your shares. Force audits. Put everything under a microscope. He thinks you're just going to sign and disappear. We'll remind him you're not dead yet." The waitress shuffled by, humming off-key, topping off our mugs without a word. The coffee steamed dark and rich, seeping a small drip onto the frayed napkin, beneath the cracked mug, bleeding into the fibers like ink. I opened the folder slowly, the paper stiff and faintly scented of toner. Legal language stared back at me, but Hollis had highlighted the key sections, his neat block letters in the margins guiding my eye. Freeze transfers. Demand reporting. Board leverage. I brushed my thumb over the underlined phrase, feeling the faint indentation of his pen. My mind flicked to the badge tucked in my jacket. Heartland's logo faded but intact. A relic that might just open doors Corbin couldn't. "You've been letting them write your story page after page," Hollis said, his voice softening. "But you're still holding the pen, Gideon. You just forgot you had it." He sipped his coffee, eyes narrowing slightly as the waitress dropped off a plate of toast so dry it looked fossilized. We both chuckled, a sound that felt almost foreign to me, after months of silent meals and colder company. The laughter loosened something in my chest, and I glanced again at the cracked mug between us, the gold tape gleaming under the cafe's flickering fluorescent light. "Why help me?" I asked after a beat. Not because I doubted him, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone in my corner. Hollis shrugged, his dry humor flickering in his eyes. "Because I remember the guy who stayed up 48 hours straight fixing the Hale audit in 2009, while everyone else was cashing bonuses. You deserve to keep your house and your dignity at the very least. Besides," he added, a smirk tugging at his lips, "I like seeing rich bullies sweat." A freight train thundered past the station, the vibration rattling the sugar jars on our table. The sound lingered in the walls, low and insistent, as Hollis leaned forward, his tone dropping into something sharper. "You've been quiet long enough, Gideon. Time to make some noise." The words hung between us like steam off the coffee, not loud, but undeniable. I closed the folder, sliding it toward me. The cardboard edges rough under my fingertips. My reflection in the cafe window looked older than I remembered, lines deeper, hair grayer, but there was a steadiness in my eyes I hadn't seen in years. As the rumble of the departing train faded, I stood tucking the folder under my arm and feeling the weight of my badge in my jacket pocket. Outside, the station platform glistened from an early morning drizzle, and somewhere in the distance, another train horn called out low and mournful. I stepped toward the door, glancing back at Hollis still nursing his chipped mug, the golden tape catching the light like a sliver of sunrise. The decision wasn't easy, but it was made. I gripped the folder tighter as I pushed through the cafe door into the chill of spring, the faint echo of the train still vibrating in my chest. The lavender hit me first. Cloying and deliberate, the kind of scent meant to mask everything else. The sweat of the staff hauling trays, the faint tang of grill smoke drifting in from the backyard, where a catered barbecue was sizzling for guests who never lifted a finger. The Hale estate was perched on its hill like it owned the sky, its high windows glowing amber against the soft stretch of a Pennsylvania summer evening. Inside, the polished marble floors reflected every chandelier's flicker, every movement so pristine that my reflection seemed thinner, older, more out of place with each step I took across the foyer. I told myself to keep my expression neutral, to wear my stoicism like a well-tailored suit. Hands clasped behind my back, jaw steady, I nodded to acquaintances I barely knew, partners of Corbin's family, friends of Loretta's, all murmuring over crystal glasses as if nothing existed beyond their circle. Seraphine floated among them in a pale green gown, her smile fixed but brittle. When her eyes met mine from across the hall, they darted away so quickly, I couldn't tell if it was guilt or shame or if she'd been coached to avoid me entirely. Corbin was never far from her hand resting on Loretta's shoulder in every public moment, his practiced grin perfectly aligned for the photographers scattered near the grand staircase. Then came the sound, Loretta's heels sharp as a metronome, each click deliberate as she crossed the expanse toward me. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence carried its own gravity, her perfume slicing through the lavender haze like a cold wind. She leaned just close enough that no one else could hear her smile, still painted on for the watching crowd. "Relics don't belong here," she murmured, her tone, silk hiding steel. My spine stiffened despite myself, but I kept my face impassive, not giving her the satisfaction of a visible wince. As I reached into my jacket for my phone, half a reflex, half a need to anchor myself, she spotted the corner of metal glinting from the inner pocket. The badge. My old Heartland Group emblem, edges dulled from years of wear, but still solid. Before I could react, Loretta's hand, all manicured grace, plucked it from my pocket, like she was removing lint. She let it dangle between two fingers for a moment, tilting it so the chandelier light flashed off its surface, and then with a casual flick, let it fall. The metallic scrape as it slid across the marble cut through the low hum of chatter like a blade. She stepped forward, and with the precision of someone used to making quiet points, brought her heel down on it, not enough to destroy it, but enough to dent the corner to mark it to make her statement. "Heartland's dead weight," she whispered, leaning closer so only I could hear. "Just like you." The scent of lavender and the faint smoke from the barbecue outside tangled in the air, suddenly sour in my throat. Around us, the party didn't pause. Champagne flutes clinked, polite laughter rippled, and not a single guest seemed to notice the humiliation playing out in miniature. I crouched slowly, the marble cool against my fingertips as I retrieved the badge. Its edge was bent now, a shallow but visible scar along the corner. I turned it over in my palm, the familiar weight slightly altered by the dent. My eyes lifted to hers, meeting the frost in her stare, without a word. I didn't give her anger or defeat, or the groveling silence she might have expected. Instead, I slid the badge back into my pocket, the faint scuff of metal on fabric loud in my own ears, and straightened to my full height. Inside, something settled, not rage, not humiliation, but a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Her words, her disdain, had done more to solidify my course than any pep talk Hollis could have given. The chandelier above caught the badge's edge as I adjusted my jacket, casting a glint that felt almost deliberate, a flicker of defiance in a hall designed to make people like me feel small. Loretta tilted her head slightly, as if to gauge whether her jab had landed. I gave her nothing but a calm nod, the ghost of a polite smile, and turned away toward the French doors that opened to the patio. The faint night breeze carried hints of hickory smoke and distant cicadas grounding me more than the perfumed halls ever could. My phone buzzed in my hand just as I stepped away from the press of people. The screen lit with Hollis's name and a message stark and to the point, ready when you are. Time to move. I looked back once at the glow of the chandeliers at Loretta's silhouette framed by the crowd. Corbin still anchored at her side. Seraphine laughing a little too loudly near the drinks table. Then I slipped the phone into my pocket beside the dented badge. Both felt heavier now, not as burdens, but as tools. The night air beyond the patio was cleaner, the lavender fading with each step toward the lawn. Somewhere in the distance, a cicada's whir hummed like a quiet engine. I drew a slow breath, the mingled sense of summer settling into something tolerable. Hollis's message echoed in my head as I crossed the flagstones, each step steady, deliberate. This wasn't just a retreat from their world. It was the first step toward the line I'd been too hesitant to cross for far too long. The hum of the fluorescent lights was the first thing I noticed when Gregory Pierce glanced up from the file in his hands. That low, unchanging buzz filled every gap between his words, like the building itself wanted to remind me I wasn't supposed to feel comfortable here. The regional headquarters of Cumberland Bank wasn't built to impress beige walls, scuffed linoleum air, faintly laced with toner and floor polish, but as I stood across from the desk, watching Gregory flip through each page with care, I felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't pride, not quite. More like the faint rush of air you get when you've been holding your breath too long. "You're listed here as an investor with asset control," Gregory said, his voice measured but clear. His glasses slid slightly down the bridge of his nose as he tapped the clause Hollis had highlighted in blue ink. "They can't touch a cent without your approval." It was a simple sentence, almost bureaucratic in tone, but I felt the tension in my shoulders ease for the first time in months. Hollis, standing just behind me with his hands folded over a slim folder, didn't so much as crack a smile, but I caught the glint in his eyes. The kind of glint that said, "Told you so," without needing the words. And then unbidden Corbin's voice rang back in my head from a dinner weeks ago at that same restaurant where Seraphine had cut me down with her "don't show your face" line. Corbin leaning back in his chair, his tone silky and dismissive. "Don't worry, we'll handle everything for you." At the time, I'd thought it was arrogance, maybe condescension. Now standing in this fluorescent-lit office with the faint smell of cleaning solutions seeping from the hallway, it sounded like a threat he hadn't expected me to counter. Gregory turned his monitor toward us. A list of transactions scrolled by neat lines of numbers, dates, and notes. My gaze snagged on the highlighted entry of full withdrawal request submitted just 3 days earlier, the name Corbin Hale stamped on the authorization line. Like a smug signature. Pending but now frozen in limbo, because Hollis had found the clause buried deep in the trust agreement. Hollis stepped closer, his finger tracing the relevant line on the screen. "This is why we're here, Greg. My client's consent wasn't given. This attempt alone could trigger a review by state regulators. We're invoking the freeze under the shareholder provision. You'll initiate the block." His tone wasn't a question so much as a polite directive, the way only Hollis could make it sound inevitable. Gregory didn't hesitate. He clicked through a few windows, the clack of his keyboard keys, a steady rhythm. On the monitor, a box popped up in stark red letters, "Access denied account, under review." The words were cold and personal, and somehow more satisfying than any shouted argument could have been. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint rustle of the legal folders Hollis set on Gregory's desk. The folder edges whispered against the surface. As Hollis opened one, sliding a notarized copy of the trust document into view. "We'll need a formal notice sent to their attorney and the wedding venue." Hollis added, his voice as calm as if he were ordering coffee. "If Corbin and Loretta threaten breach or try to move vendors, we want the paper trail clear. No surprises." Gregory nodded already. Scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen scratching softly against the paper. The sound blended with the hum of the overhead lights and the distant whir of a copier down the hall, creating a strange sort of symphony of bureaucracy. In that moment, I realized I'd never thought of toner and paper as comforting smells before, but there was something oddly grounding about it, the scent of a system, slow and grinding, finally working in my favor. I glanced at Hollis, who was now tucking the last folder back under his arm, his expression almost serene. He didn't need to say it, but I could see the satisfaction in the subtle set of his jaw. We'd turned their own machinery against them, and for once I wasn't just the man being maneuvered. Gregory leaned back, folding his hands over the file. The freeze is active as of now. Until the investigation concludes, nothing moves without your signature. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt like someone in the room saw me as more than a mark. I exhaled slowly, the sound louder than I expected in the otherwise quiet office. Outside, through the narrow blinds, I could see the bare branches swaying against the slate-gray sky, their movement gentle but persistent, like a reminder that autumn doesn't ask for permission to arrive. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket, the vibration sharp against the muted air of the office. I pulled it out, and the screen lit up with a message from Seraphine Dad. "What did you do? The wedding might be off." For a long moment, I just stared at the words. The faint glow of the screen reflected in Gregory's glasses and the polished surface of his desk. Hollis raised a brow but didn't speak. I could feel the faint tremor in my hand as I slid the phone back into my coat, the dented edge of my old Heartland badge brushing against my knuckles in the same pocket. The hum of the fluorescent lights returned to the forefront, steady and unyielding as we left Gregory's office. The echo of our footsteps down the hall sounded heavier than the situation itself, though for the first time, not because of dread. Outside, the late afternoon chill cut through my coat as we stepped into the parking lot, the smell of damp leaves mingling with the faint scent of exhaust. My phone buzzed again, another message I didn't bother checking yet. Instead, I looked at Hollis, who simply said, "They'll come harder now. Be ready." He opened his car door, his words lingering in the cool air like the vapor from our breath. As he drove off, I stood alone by my sedan, watching the sky shift from gray to the dim blue of early evening, the bank's glass doors reflecting the parking lot lights behind me. My hand drifted back to the badge, its dent pressing into my palm, as if to remind me this wasn't over, but for once, I wasn't playing by their script anymore. The smell of aftershave hit me as soon as I stepped into Hollis's law office, mingling with the faint char of burnt toast drifting up from the diner downstairs. The combination was strange, sharp, almost antiseptic, with a layer of comfort underneath, like the air itself was reminding me I was somewhere both dangerous and safe. The office was small, paneled in faded oak, the only sound a steady hum from the laser printer in the corner. Its rhythmic churn almost felt like a metronome, keeping time for everything we were about to do. Hollis sat behind his desk, his tie loosened but his grin sharp, a lawyer's grin. He tapped the stack of drafts in front of him as I lowered myself into the worn leather chair across from him. Stephen Hull. His partner leaned against the filing cabinet with a notepad, his pen tapping softly against the edge. "They thought they could paint you as some relic tyrant," Stephen said, sliding a sheet toward me. The paper was warm, freshly printed, the ink scent mingling with that faint aftershave in the air. "We've got the trust documents, the email trail, even Corbin's own signature, authorizing the freeze before they spun it into some sob story. Their narrative doesn't hold." I looked down at the headline from the Daily Sun spread across Hollis's desk. Bold, sensational, retired controller sabotages. Daughter's wedding, financial tyranny, or betrayal. The photo beneath showed me stepping out of the Cumberland Bank building last week, shoulders hunched against the cold, the caption designed to make me look like a man skulking away from decency. I traced the edge of the page with one finger, slow and deliberate, before setting it aside. The faint weight of my dented Heartland badge in my pocket seemed heavier now, grounding me as Hollis spoke. "The correction goes live in 2 hours. Hollis continued, nodding toward the blinking cursor on his laptop. The draft headline, still unsent, glowed on the screen. "Correction March Family Dispute Involves Valid Trust Rights. No Wrongdoing," by Gideon March. The cursor blinked patiently at the end of the sentence, a silent invitation for closure. Outside the office door, I heard the faint thud of the morning edition landing on the hallway floor, the newsboy's muffled voice carrying up from the street below. Stephen stepped closer, setting a manila folder on the desk between us. "This isn't just damage control. We're filing a countersuit for defamation if they don't back off. Loretta's fingerprints are all over this smear campaign. We give them the option retract or deal with us in court." His voice was low but firm, his pen no longer tapping. Hollis leaned back, that sly grin softening into something closer to respect as he looked at me. "Your call, Gideon. We can play it quiet or make it loud, but either way you don't lose." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I listened to the printer's hum as another draft slid out to the creak of the floorboards as someone passed by outside, to the faint sizzle of bacon and toast from the diner below. Ordinary sounds anchoring me in a moment that could easily have felt surreal. I thought back to a night years ago, Seraphine barely 20, when I told her over takeout pizza, "If you ever use my name to get ahead, make sure you're ready to defend it." At the time, she laughed, rolling her eyes, her head resting against the back of our old plaid couch. I never thought the words would circle back like this, sharp and ironic. The phone on Hollis's desk buzzed, breaking the quiet. My own phone lit up a second later, Seraphine's name filling the screen. I hesitated before swiping to answer the echo of my own voice from years ago, still lingering in my head. "Dad." Her voice cracked softer than I'd heard it in years. No indignation, no sharp edges, just fear. "I didn't know it would get this far. The wedding, the vendors are pulling out. Loretta's talking about selling off some of Corbin's assets just to keep things afloat. Can we talk?" I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the faint hiss of the printer cooling down, the muffled laughter of barbers chatting below, and her shaky breath on the line. "You had a choice, Sarah," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "You made it." There was a pause long enough for me to hear her sniffle, and then the line went dead. I stared at the phone a moment longer before setting it down on the stack of papers Hollis had prepared. Almost immediately, another buzz. A text this time from Corbin. "We'll see you in court." No preamble, no emotion, just a declaration of war typed out in stark black letters. I stared at it for a beat, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly in the office window behind Hollis. He glanced at me, waiting, but I didn't reply. Not yet. Outside, the late autumn wind howled faintly through the narrow alley between the buildings, carrying the scent of leaves and the faint sweetness of toast still wafting up from below. I rose from the chair, tucking the badge deeper into my pocket, until the dented edge pressed into my palm. Hollis stood too, sliding the correction draft across the desk toward me. The blinking cursor still waited, patient as ever. "Let's send it," I said finally, my voice even. Hollis's grin returned, subtle but sure, as his fingers flew across the keyboard. The soft whoosh of the sent email was almost anticlimactic, but it carried the weight of something far heavier than the sound suggested. As I stepped out into the hall, the fresh edition of the Daily Sun sat waiting on the mat. I picked it up, the headline still screaming its accusation, and folded it once before tucking it under my arm. The staircase down smelled of hair tonic and coffee grounds, familiar in a way that almost steadied me. The day outside was gray, the kind of gray that pressed on your shoulders, but as I opened the door to the street, a thin shaft of sun broke through the clouds, lighting the wet pavement ahead of me. My phone buzzed again as I stepped into that patch of light, but I didn't look at it. Not yet. The hum of the printer, the blink of the cursor. Seraphine's trembling voice, all of it lingered as I walked toward my car, the badge still firm in my grip. Whatever came next, court or compromise, I knew this much for the first time in years. I wasn't just weathering their storm. I was in it, steering straight into the wind. The scratch of Corbin's pen on the legal paper cut through the silence like a faint saw, deliberate and slow. Each stroke echoed against the thick walls of Hollis's private meeting room, the faint tick of the clock overhead, marking the seconds until he pushed the pen away and muttered, jaw tight, "You win, old man." His voice carried more resentment than volume, the kind of quiet surrender that leaves a bad taste on the tongue. The warm lamplight softened the shadows around the table, but nothing in the room felt warm. The wooden blinds were drawn tight, muting the soft rumble of distant thunder outside. Loretta sat across from me, back rigid, her hands folded so neatly in her lap, it looked rehearsed. For a moment, while Hollis gathered the signed pages, her gaze drifted toward the open folder beside him. A framed photo of Catherine, my late wife, rested just inside a placeholder. I'd kept there more for myself than anyone else. Loretta's eyes lingered unreadable before she looked away. Regret, calculation. With her, it was hard to tell. The faint perfume she wore, violets and something sharper, hung in the air like an unasked question. Hollis and Stephen moved with quiet precision, gathering documents, clipping signatures together, their murmurs low and professional. They weren't celebrating. This was never about victory for them, just resolution. Across the table, Corbin's posture sagged despite his stiff collar. The faint sheen of sweat along his hairline betrayed the calm front he'd tried to maintain all afternoon. His signature delivered more than the trust funds, 70% of them to be exact. It delivered my house back into my name, free of the entanglements they'd woven, and my exit from their world on my own terms. Loretta broke the quiet first. Her words soft as silk, but edged like glass, sliced through the measured calm. "You'll die alone, Gideon. No house full of heirs, no one left to visit." She adjusted her coat cuff as she said it like she was merely commenting on the weather. I met her gaze steady and unflinching, my voice low but clear, rather alone than bought. The answer landed heavier than I expected, a weight in the room that no one immediately disturbed. Hollis glanced at me, his expression unreadable, but his slight nod said enough. Seraphine sat a step back from the table, her shoulders drawn and hands folded in her lap. She hadn't spoken since she entered, not when Corbin signed, not when Loretta hissed her final barb. Her eyes flicked once toward me, empty, exhausted, before she looked down at the polished wood grain of the table. When the meeting ended, she rose quietly, clutching her clutch purse like it might anchor her. She walked out without a word, the sound of the door clicking shut behind her, softer than the distant thunder rolling beyond the blinds. I stayed seated for a long moment, staring at the stack of signed agreements, the embossed seals catching the lamplight. The faint scent of toner still clung to the papers. Then I reached into my coat pocket and drew out the dented Heartland badge. Its corner, bent from Loretta's heel weeks ago, caught the light in a way that almost looked deliberate, like a scar turned ornament. I slid it across the table toward Hollis. "Frame it," I said, my voice carrying the first hint of relief I'd felt in months. It earned it. He studied it for a moment, then tucked it gently into a folder marked for safekeeping, no words needed. The clock on the wall ticked softly, steady as rain as I rose to leave. The heavy carpet muffled my footsteps as I crossed to the door. Hollis followed me out, Stephen lingering behind to file the last of the papers. In the hallway, the scent of coffee drifted up from the diner downstairs, mingling with the faint ozone of the approaching storm. The first patter of rain tapped against the windows as I stepped into the elevator, the muted hum of its descent matching the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Hours later at home, the storm had rolled in fully. Rain drummed against the roof, steady and relentless, while I sat by the window, watching the streetlights blur through the street glass. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. A message from Seraphine, just 2 words, "Goodbye, Dad." The glow of the screen lit the room for a moment before fading back to the soft darkness. I didn't reply. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, listening to the rain and the distant rumble of thunder, feeling a strange mix of finality and calm settle in my chest. For the first time in a long while, silence didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like peace. The smell of cut pine hung thick in the air, warm and resinous, as the late summer sun spilled through the open garage doors of the Catherine March Memorial Workshop. Sawdust clung to the floor like golden powder, softening the hum of footsteps as students moved from bench to bench, their voices low but bright with energy. The rhythmic whir of a cordless drill rose and fell somewhere near the back, underscored by the faint scratch of chalk as someone updated the day's schedule on a board, pinned to the wall college brochures, handwritten notes, and a few faded photos taped up alongside it like fragments of a mosaic. Above the central workbench, framed in simple walnut, hung my old Heartland group badge. Cleaned its faded edges, polished the dent along its corner visible, but no longer jarring. It caught the light every time someone passed beneath it. The soft click of its frame when the breeze from the open doors stirred, the air felt almost intentional, as though the past itself were nodding along with what was happening here. Legacy, not leverage. Not anymore. I stood near the largest bench holding a folder with the first scholarship certificates we'd ever issued. my voice steady as I introduced the day's guest speaker, a retired machinist, who now taught night classes at Lehigh Carbon. The students' hands still dusty from their projects gathered in a semicircle. Their eyes focused a few stealing glances at the brochures pinned behind me, as if they might already see their futures spelled out there. When the applause came, it wasn't loud or ceremonial, just a warm ripple that filled the converted garage, with something more comforting than any boardroom cheer I'd ever known. Later, Hollis and I settled under the shade of an old oak just outside 2 glasses of iced tea, sweating onto the wooden table between us. The cicadas buzzed faintly in the distance, the kind of lazy soundtrack that only midsummer could produce. Hollis had his sleeves rolled past his elbows, a rare concession to the heat, and leaned back with a satisfied exhale. "Not bad for a man everyone wrote off 2 years ago," he said, his voice carrying a thread of amusement rather than triumph. I watched the interns through the open doors, one of them adjusting the drill, while another brushed sawdust from the workbench, their chatter rising and falling like a tide. "It's not about proving anyone wrong," I said, turning my glass slowly so the ice clinked against the sides. "It's about leaving something that doesn't need to be defended." The iced tea was cold earthy with just enough lemon to cut the sweetness, a taste that felt more honest than anything the Hales had ever poured. A car pulled up on the street just beyond the gravel drive, its engine idling low. Through the glare of the late afternoon sun on the windshield, I caught a glimpse of Seraphine's face. She didn't step out, didn't roll down the window, just sat there watching. Her expression was unreadable from this distance, somewhere between curiosity and hesitation, maybe something softer. The taillights flared as she shifted into gear, and then the car rolled away, its shape shrinking against the line of maples down the block until it disappeared entirely. I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, and murmured more to myself than to Hollis. "It's okay." The words floated off with the breeze absorbed by the rustle of leaves overhead. Hollis didn't press, just took another sip of his tea, and tilted his head back toward the sky where a few early evening clouds drifted like lazy sailboats. The last of the interns were packing up as the sun dipped lower, their laughter faint but genuine as they wiped their hands and closed up the workshop. One of the older students, a lanky kid with a streak of sawdust across his shirt, lingered by the oak, hesitating before asking Mr. March, "You ever miss it, the boardroom, I mean?" I looked at him at the workshop behind him, where the drill had finally gone silent, where the scent of fresh pine still lingered in the cooling air. My mouth curved into a smile, unforced quiet. Not for a second. The evening breeze stirred again, rattling the badge frame inside the workshop with a soft, deliberate click, as though echoing the sentiment. The sound blended with the distant chorus of cicadas, the fading laughter of students, and the quiet clink of our ice settling in the glasses. The day was ending, but for the first time in years, the weight I carried didn't feel like something to set down. It felt like something finally worth holding. The last light of summer spilled across the workshop's open doors, catching on the dented badge now polished and framed above the bench. Its quiet gleam felt less like a scar and more like proof that even what's bent can still hold meaning. I've learned that drawing boundaries doesn't mean bitterness. It means choosing peace over being pulled apart. Sometimes bridges must fall so we see which ones are worth rebuilding. For anyone facing loss or betrayal, there's still room to craft something lasting, a purpose that outlives the hurt. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? I'd love to hear your story below.